Okay, let's take it again from that last question.
Okay. As I was saying, one of the things is I think people have different challenges depending on where they are in their organization. I know we've had different challenges at different points. The big challenge for us has always been in terms of donor funding. Obviously, we're coming to Liberia I came from Liberia, running a very small organization. A lot of people had not heard of it. We didn't have access to big foundations and organizations. So a lot of the work, actually, which a lot of our fundraising came from the same models that Ocean used for Youth for Environmental Sanity were really grassroots type, which we still utilize today. In fact, since the organization started back in 2005, we've really only done one major, we said never again. And since then, we've really focused on grassroots fundraising, family foundation, etc. But fundraising has been one of the great challenges that we have had.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
I'm Allison. So in the CNN video that we watched earlier, you had mentioned your position on foreign aid and how you wanted to decrease aid dependency in Liberia. I was just curious about what maybe your opinion was on nonprofit organizations working in Liberia. Are there maybe sub-methods of aid that they are utilizing that you think might not be as effective? And what do you think would be more effective?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things that I've always Ocean, there's a little feedback. Maybe.
Okay, let's see if we can stop it.
I want to see if I should mute mine.
Okay.
My earphone.
Yeah, I'll mute for a second. Okay, did that stop it?
So I'm not sure. I'm not hearing the feedback, but hopefully you can hear me clearly.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So one of the things that I've always said is that, there is a need for certain types of aid. So immediately after war, devastation, like in the case of Haiti, in the case of post-war Liberia, in the case of the Japanese, the tsunami in Japan, obviously immediately after those disasters, people do need immediate humanitarian assistance in terms of water, in terms of shelter, etc. So it's not to say that those things should never be provided. If you look at Syria, you look at Syria being a great example. Nobody could go into Syria and say, how do we start to provide entrepreneurship opportunities for these people? Because really, if you're in that state, all you're thinking about is surviving from day to day. But what happens is, or the problem is, if you have the situation where immediate conflict has ended and several months or several years have passed, and aid agencies are still only focused on handouts, then that creates a problem. Because what's key to people at that point is starting to rebuild their lives. So again, going back to the Syria situation, if and when, and I would say when the conflict in Syria is resolved and peace returns, obviously people will be coming back from refugee camps, etc. They'll be trying to settle. And the next question is, how do I build my livelihood? If you have parents who could feed their families, they don't want to be depending on relief rations and stuff like that. So that's when it becomes very necessary that the aid transform from emergency aid to more sustainable aid. And that's why in my work at Youth Action, and we encourage a lot of our partners to work on, is providing the training, the tools, the microloans to start their business. And I've always said that just because something is at that point, what's accepted as the best practice does not mean that you cannot question the essence or the effectiveness of that kind of aid. And I'll give you a case in point. Micro lending, for example, is championed around the world as the perfect solution for ending world poverty. Now, this is true because with microloans, people are able to start businesses, etc. But not all microloans are the best for the people. So, for example, I'll give you an example in Liberia. One of the microloan organizations, and I'm not going to name who that organization is charging a 14% interest on the microloans they give. Now, that's very high. I mean, if it's you expect microloan to have much lower interest rates, but they're charging 14%, but they're still considered a microloan entity, and they're still considered like doing something that's transformed. But what is happening for most of the people we talk to was that it was having a very negative effect because they were paying so much money back. They had a very short term to make payments, etc. So even though microloan in general, like I said, is great, it's a good source of sustainable development, but not all microloans are necessarily in the interest of the people that they seek to serve. So even what is seen as the best in theory, you yourself have to always look at the organization, look at what they're doing and how they're doing, and looking at all the details to conclude if this is really working. But I think the best aid is aid that helps people become sustainable, and the best aid is helping people to get off their 2 feet after they face devastation. So.
Can I ask one more question? Sorry, I have one more question. Do you think that there's generally an issue with nonprofit organizations coming in and not necessarily knowing how their programs are going to affect society or the economy or the local economy? It's kind of like the good intentions don't necessarily mean that there's going to be good results. So do you think that there is like a large issue with that, or do you think that it's getting better?
Well, I think it's both ways. First of all, yes, it has been a major issue. One of the articles I did my master's at the University of Pennsylvania in nonprofit management, NGO management. And one of the articles that I still carry today is an article called "Helping People is Not Easy." And if you look that up, I suggest you read it very well. The article is called, again, "Helping People is Not Easy." But it talks about the complexities of aid, even sustainable aid. I mean, there are many organizations who have come in with ideas that actually have had an adverse effect. So one example that I can give you, and this has been happening in communities of Africa, like even across Africa, where there are organizations who came in and looked at the situation, the humanitarian situation, for example, something like water, and saw that people were getting water from streams and rivers and stuff like that, which of course they said were unsafe. And so they went to work, build a hand pump in the middle of these communities to provide safe drinking water. Who would think that would have an adverse effect? You provided safe drinking water for a community. Unfortunately, that did have an adverse effect because the situation was that most of the men in the towns and villages, the only time they had to talk about social issues, to talk about concerns with family, to talk about what was happening in their communities with each other's children, was during the time that they walked from the village to the open stream to collect water and stuff like that, because that was really when all the women came together and had the chance to talk, because once you're home, you never got the chance to talk on social issues, etc. And so that actually had an adverse effect. So it had to be looked at and said, okay, how do we replan a strategy like this? Even in our own case, in the youth action case, when we started off our programs very, very early, we started out doing women's empowerment centers in Liberia. These were centers for very, very young women who are coming from slum communities to come to the centers and learn a skill in Liberia and Sierra Leone. The first time we opened, we had tremendous pushback and very, very low attendance. And when we went into the communities to find out and research what exactly was happening, in fact, because the first time before we went in, we had done initial research and everybody had said, yes, empower the women. Women are the ones, and even the men were saying our women need to be empowered. So we're wondering, why is it that these centers have been opened and we've brought in all the tools to empower the women, and now there's pushback and the women are not coming, etc. And it turns out that the problem was, even after we had opened the center and registered the women, we actually needed now as a group to go back into the communities and inform their husbands officially that their wives were now in these centers, because the husband's perspective was that their young wives were lying, that they actually were not going to school, and that they were simply going to see a boyfriend. So we learned right there. So that had severe social impact, because of course women were going back home, they were getting yelled at, some were getting beaten, there were issues of domestic violence around that. So from there we learned that we had to come back. Even after we accepted women, we had to go back to the families, we had to go back to the husbands, the mothers, the fathers, bring them together, explain exactly what we're doing and highlighting the benefits. That was the other key, that we needed to highlight the benefits of this program, that it wasn't just something that the women would take off and sort of then become sort of like the grand poobahs, because that was what the men were also worried about. But essentially we had to demonstrate how this would help the entire family and help the entire community. So again, that was learning by error. And this is one of the things to be very, very concerned of if you're running any development programs. That is not that your program will be perfect from start to finish, but it's about constantly evaluating it and being able to make changes to address the people who you're benefiting. But if you try to do a rigid program straight through without making any changes or reflecting the needs or wants of the communities, that will have the most devastating impact. It's always good to be fluid and willing to change if change is necessary.
Great, thank you so much.
Anybody else? Yes, Willow.
Hello.
Hello.
So, as an aspiring mediator, what would you say your advice is on getting two sides that vehemently disagree to like come together and understand each other's point of view? Because as we saw, like with your work, that you got the different, I guess, war leaders to give up the children soldiers. Like, how would you? What is your advice on how to like get people to understand each other?
Well, I mean, obviously, every situation and every conflict has different dynamics. There's different fundamental reasons why those conflicts have started. There's different reasons why they've been fueled, etc. So the most important thing that I've always found is understanding context. It's really about getting down and understanding at the very fundamental level on both sides what the perception of the root of the problem is, and understanding the context that both sides are dealing with. In the case of the Children's Disarmament Campaign, the fundamentals of it was rooted in the entire armed conflict. So obviously, the conflict had one aspect of ethnic violence, the other side was resources, but directly related to child soldiers was this issue that child soldiers were the strongest military arm for these rebel groups, that they did need them, and there were no other way out, essentially. So a big part of the protest that happened across the capital and the talks that we had with the warlords, etc., was going in and demonstrating the devastating effects to the children, but there was also significant pressure that we were putting on them, and also following up on basically international attention, and also the threat to them of facing war crimes and crimes against humanity for the use of children in war, because we were really pushing the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and how that had an effect. But we've worked in Uganda with the Karamoja tribe, which had lots of differences over cattle rustling, for example. And a big part of that, stepping back and actually letting the young people together come together from the various tribes and basically talk about the various issues that have faced them, and sort of like understanding what the root of their problems and hatred was. And, what was interesting in the case of those particular tribes was that nobody actually remembered, because what had happened was that the hatred has simply been passed down generations, and it was sort of like the great grandfather told the grandfather told the father, and the father told the son. Simply just those people are not our friends. And that has been sustained over a long period. And then we started getting young people together, whether it was around community festivals or football, sports, basically activities that young people naturally love, that they're drawn to. It wasn't sort of like come for this big UN conference, which of course everybody comes prepared with their negotiating points and their paper and their pad, but simply coming around something that was fun, whether it was sports, it's a festival, etc., that brought both sides together. And in that process of having fun together, it's almost like a natural realization that the differences are really not there, and the hatred that people have held for a long time really does not exist. But it's the opportunity to put people together. That's the first step. Especially the young people, because again, that's why I said the hope for Africa is, in many cases, if you try to bring the older generations together, it's very, very difficult, but I think young people have the capacity to see the world in more colors, essentially. And that has made so much difference in terms of bringing people from diverse background and saying, let's hang out, let's see what's up, and at that point, that necessarily not solve wars immediately, but what it has is an effect on future generations, because those young people, they're having their children, will now be saying to them, not necessarily passing on those messages of hate, but will now say, hey, I've got brother, friend on the other side, on the other tribe. We interacted. We had a great time. No, they're not the devils that people say they are. And so when they have their kids can also connect, and it has an effect. Whether it's Israel and Palestine, I think if we start to bring those relationships together and bring young people from both sides, whether it's young people from North and South Korea, etc. And like I said, it's not going to end the war immediately. At least it will start to build that connection of the young generation, knowing that there's not this whole sense of great evil that has been put in, or personal evil that's been put in, but people beginning to understand that we can see eye to something, and if you really think to it, we're not all that very different people.
Thank you.
Hello. So my question was about the work that you do now or the work that you've done in the past. I'm in an NGO entrepreneurship class, and I'm creating an NGO based on, well, you said how kind of like reinstating the livelihood of people in post-conflict societies is, I believe, also is one of the most important things to do, to kind of give people hope that from now on things will be different, that their life will get better. And I think the way you can start with that is through education, especially because that's something that is missing during a lot of conflicts. So I'm working on South Sudan because it's the most recent kind of nation that's been recognized by the UN, so it's like very recent conflict that just ended. And I'm aiming at kind of rebuilding the education system, starting with primary education, but not even necessarily for young children, just people who like miss that part of their life. And so
Right.
I was wondering if you could give me any advice or tips, kind of, since you've worked with a lot of those sort of, hopes and aspirations, if you could give me any sort of advice as to what are the main things to focus on at the very beginning stages of that process.
Great.
Apart
Well,
from fundraising, because I know the fundraising thing is everyone's worst nightmare, but like once you get the money and like once you have all that, like what are some of the most important things to do in terms of rebuilding a war-torn society and the people
Right.
living in it?
Well, I know that Unshin and I share a great friend, and I know she's so busy, so the chance of her coming to speak might be difficult, but her name is Lynn Twist, and of course her perspective on fundraising is not that it's the people giant in the room, but it can also be beautiful and rewarding. So if you're looking at an organization and fundraising, I suggest you check out her book, The Soul of Money, because she has some very great insights into fundraising. Because again, it's such a crucial part of the work that we're doing and that you want to do, and you will spend such a tremendous amount of your time. Again, unless you're fortunate that the first day you get out there and you get, a hell of a lot of money, you're going to spend a lot of time fundraising. So it has to be something that you actually see some passion and beauty in. So I don't want it to appear like the thing that you run away from whenever you see it. It's just been very challenging in my case, but it's something that I know I have to do every day. Now I can tell you that one of the things that has happened, and this is why I feel comfortable doing fundraising on an individual and a level, is the friendships that I've built. I've actually had some of the best and greatest friendships with people who are our largest donors. And in fact, the first major donor that we had was actually someone or a couple that I actually met at one of Ocean's events. Now, what I have realized is that if you see a prospective donor just in terms of dollar signs, it doesn't have a long-term relationship approach, essentially. But this was a great experience for me because when we were talking at this event, I didn't see them as donors because I had never met them. I actually were discussing with them as friends. And we had a long conversation. They had asked lots of questions and stuff like that. But from my perspective, I'm thinking, I wasn't in fundraising mood. I wasn't like, oh, these are funders, etc. And then they turned out, even to this day, to be one of our largest donors. Similar story, again, with a woman who I met at another event in California. And we started to talk, it was one of those things where I was in the room, I wasn't thinking about who was who or who's doing what. I knew there were a lot of people who had potential to be donors, but I also knew there were a lot of people from organizational background. So again, we built a relationship there. We went on to meeting several times for lunch in New York. Again, I had no fundraising capital, just like this is a great friendship that we're building. And she always referred to herself simply as Lorraine Powell. And then eventually we received a donation, which was actually a large donation from her. It was only a few months later when the letter from her lawyers had come confirming this donation that I realized that her name was Lorraine Powell Jobs, obviously the wife of Steve Jobs, who I had had all these conversations and lunches with and had no idea who I was talking to, which was another valuable experience because if you can imagine, if in the beginning I had seen her and said, wow, this is Steve Jobs' wife, it would have been in a different context, in a different mood. So anyway, I just want you to remember that. On the part about education, it's one thing that I feel is the fundamental. So even in Youth Action International, we have 3 missions. It's education, healthcare, economic empowerment. With education, we rarely focus on early childhood development because, like you said, and I completely agree, that the key to building the nation is the key to educating its people. And nations who have had a lot of war, like in the case of Liberia, someone was 10 when it started. When the war ended at 24, now you can't take that person back to elementary school. So in that case, you have to build their capacity in terms of vocational training, micro-lending. But then now the key is the young people, the next generation, how to prepare the next generation to tackle the challenges. And that's why a big, huge part of our work in Liberia and Sierra has been with development for the early childhood sector, which I think is absolutely critical because if you can reach to those kids, you're able to avert so many potential chaos happening down the road. And you basically, the way I see our work with early childhood development and early childhood education is that we actually be greatest by reaching out to these kids at too early an age. So I think it's very, very important. Also, the other thing to remember is, school, especially countries you're talking about, is a melting pot. In all the countries, even countries that have ethnic divides, because Africa for the
You know what, Kimmie? Kimmie, you know what? We're getting you cutting out again, so let's just start the call one more time. We just have a few more minutes, but let's do it fresh, okay?